Last week, we talked about the poetry and the university, and I began with some big questions and some big principles. But I'm afraid it was pretty surface level. I meant for it to be, but there are deeper problems beneath the surface that I want to dig into today. And a lot of this has to do with the question of apprenticeship. See, one of the reasons why there has been in the last 200 years this question of whether the writing of poetry and the training of poets belongs to the university or outside of the university is that poetry from the ancient world to the present is more in line with the crafts, sculpture, pottery, shoemaking, songwriting, things like this, than, say, the liberal arts, something like the study of logic or the study of rhetoric. Now, poetry is odd because it involves grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It involves some aspects of music, which is one of the liberal arts. And yet, the formal study of learning how to be a poet is something that requires apprenticeship, more like apprenticing with a shoemaker or more like apprenticing with a blacksmith than, say, learning the rules of logic or learning the doctrines of Christianity. After all, especially in America, the earliest universities started for the teaching of Christian doctrine and the training up of pastors, not of poets. Poetry, as we talked about last time with things like MFA programs, came to be under the purview of the university, especially the graduate study. But for thousands of years, poets were apprenticed by other poets, and it didn't need to be part of the university. And when poetry was talked about at the university, it was at the level of analysis. It was at the level of what we might call literary criticism. After all, we've done videos in the past about the Oxford Professor of Poetry, which is a position that's lasted several centuries. The Oxford Professor of Poetry is not there to teach you how to write poetry. The Oxford Professor of Poetry, from the late Enlightenment era onward, has been there to talk about the evaluation of poetry, the interpretation of poetry. This is something that T.S. Eliot talks about quite a bit, that the job of the critic is to say what poetry is as a whole, and then evaluate individual acts of poetry, objects of the poet's art. But it's not for the training of poets particularly. So how do you train a poet? Is that something that the university can do? Well, poetry as apprenticeship is a concept that, one, not everyone agrees with, but I'm going to assume it for a minute, that in order to become an accomplished poet, a practicer of poetry, you need to look at the work of people who are better at the craft than you and learn how to imitate them, and hopefully be guided directly and intentionally by them, just like you would learn cobbling from a cobbler or smithing from a blacksmith. Now, how does that work in poetry? Well, it works by observing, understanding, and imitating the techniques of those who came before you. This works really well if you have a living mentor, a poet who can teach you the basics of writing poetry. This often happens throughout history in communities where there are, one, shared values of an art form like poetry, and two, systems of relationships between older generations and younger generations, where younger generations expect to be and are apprenticed and supported by their families in their apprenticeship of poets. We see this as far back as Sappho. Sappho writes about what we think of as almost like an arts colony on the island of Lesbos, in the city of Mytilene, in the 7th, 6th century BC, where older women poets and musicians are teaching younger women poets and musicians. And we can see from the poetry of that era that, there's squabbling, who's the favorite student and who's more accomplished than who at lyre playing or lyric poetry. If we move forward to something like the Renaissance, we see, you have these master poets and master writers, Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, even William Shakespeare, who are looking at the generation that came before them, learning from them, and even kind of having competition with them. We think of Shakespeare's competition with Marlowe. They're both learning from each other and kind of challenging each other to do better, and they're not at a university. Now, the problem with not being at a university is often you're learning directly from the older generation who may or may not have learned from the generation before them, who may or may not have learned from the generation before them. And sometimes you're getting apprenticeship in the art at present, but not necessarily in the historical memory of the art. And this is where the published page and university libraries and university structures come into play. Because someone like John Donne, who was able to study at an English university in the generation after Shakespeare, had access to just texts that maybe Shakespeare didn't directly have access to. And we see, especially in the 1600s and onward, the beginning of a tradition. We see this with Milton at Cambridge and later poets as well, where they get to go to, I think, what we would think of as undergraduate study. And yes, learn from professors and poets who are still living, but also be exposed to the written work of the past. If you're Milton at Cambridge, you get to read the work of Donne, your older contemporary, the work of Shakespeare of the previous generation, but also the work of Sidney, also the work of Thomas Wyatt, also the work of Geoffrey Chaucer, also because you're reading Latin and trained in Latin at Cambridge. If you're John Milton, you get to read the Latin poetry of the classical era by someone like Chaucer, Virgil. And you get to be apprenticed not just by your living elders, but by the preserved texts of the past. And this is something that universities became, from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and beyond, very good at doing, preserving not only, the memory of how to analyze and imitate poetic techniques, but just preserving the texts themselves. And having people around who know what texts to read. If you're Shakespeare and you go to the theater, maybe your theater buddies who are a little older than you, maybe they know the right text to read, but maybe they don't. Maybe they're not terribly educated. If you go to Cambridge, though, and you're John Milton, you get professors who can say, oh, no, you got to start with Homer, and then you got to read Virgil, and maybe you need to read Apollonius of Rhodes, and you need to read Statius, and you need to read Lucan, and you need to read Ovid, and then you need to read the medievals, and then you need to read, the more contemporary poets, Shakespeare, Donne, etc. And then once you've read that, then you'll know all the many languages and forms that you have inherited that you get to then imitate and work on. So this long rambling talking about Shakespeare and Milton has been to say Milton and the English poets who went to university had access to more opportunities for apprenticeship, more opportunities to see excellence of the poetic past than those who didn't get to go to university. I think the story of Alexander Pope is a really good counterexample here. Alexander Pope was Roman Catholic. His family did not convert to Anglicanism in the 1600s when many families did. John Donne's family converted from Catholicism to Anglicanism, which is why he was able to go to university and be an Anglican minister. Alexander Pope's family, the next century, early 1700s, they remained Catholic and thus were sometimes in legal trouble because of it, but they staunchly remained Roman Catholic. Pope grew up knowing other literary writers in his teens and his college years, but knowing because he was a committed Catholic, he wouldn't be allowed to go to Oxford, Cambridge, St. Andrews, any of these schools that would have been places he could have studied the poetry of the past and apprenticed himself to that. So what did Pope have to do? Pope had to self-educate. And we know that Pope did self-educate. Pope not only, read Milton, read Shakespeare, read Donne, read Chaucer. Pope also read the classical poets in their ancient languages and then translated the Iliad into English, into rhyming couplets of English. This was something that he didn't have a chance to do at university because the universities wouldn't allow him in because he was the wrong religion. And so he had to self-educate. And I think we can see in Pope, he self-educated pretty well, but it was harder to be apprenticed to the tradition if you're Pope than if you're Milton, precisely because you have access to university libraries, to university guidance, in a way that Pope didn't. Now, Pope was, I think, probably a prodigy and arguably is as good a poet as Milton, if not better. But he had to seek out that apprenticeship outside of a formal institution that could just give him the right books to read. Phillis Wheatley, a generation after Pope, is a really good example of someone in America who had to do the same thing. Phillis Wheatley came of age as a writer in America just before the Revolution, but she couldn't go to Harvard. She couldn't go to Princeton. She couldn't go to the early Ivy Leagues, not just because she was a woman, but because she was a black slave. And of course, if they're not letting white women into Harvard, they're certainly not letting black slaves in. Now, Phillis Wheatley self-educated partly by partnering with the daughters of her enslavers to learn as much as she could, kind of being home educated as a teen girl. She read Pope, which I think is really awesome. I hope she knew that Pope had to self-educate himself because he too was kept out of university learning. I like to think that Wheatley kind of bonded with Pope's poetry over that. I don't know that for a fact, but I speculate about that. But she also, of course, read Shakespeare and Milton and Chaucer. She was especially drawn to the Roman poets, Virgil, Ovid, and others. And so she had to self-educate. She had to say, they're not going to allow me to walk into the halls where they hand me all the access to the tradition. I'm going to go out and find it for myself. And so Pope and Wheatley are these great examples of outsider poets who basically have to university educate themselves. Now, there's a distinction here to be made between university education that gives you the poets of the past and the act of taking those poets, not just as really great books to learn wisdom and beauty from, but as books to learn your craft from. And that's something that even at Oxford, even at Cambridge, even at Harvard, the poet wasn't necessarily expected to be taught their craft directly in a creative writing class way. In those centuries that we've been talking about, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, it really only is in the 1900s, in the 20th century, that we say, oh, we'll read Milton and then kind of give you a creative writing class where you imitate Milton. It was kind of expected you do that on your own. But as one of my comments said on my last video, it can be really hard and frustrating as a writer to say, well, I really want to be apprenticed well. I don't want to have to go to college, or maybe I went to college, but I don't want to have to go to grad school for creative writing. It's expensive. It's difficult to get in often to MFA programs. But I feel shut out of just the knowledge. People are sitting there who know which books to read, who know the right techniques to practice, and I don't have access to them. So I think this is the dilemma. We need to find the place where the tradition can be accessed, where the tradition of poetry, either from our regional tradition, our country's tradition, our linguistic tradition, but also world tradition. Where can you access that? Well, you can access that at university, but there's a barrier, there's a cost to entry that can feel like gatekeeping. Yet we live in an age, and we talked about this in the last video, we live in an age where you can go read pretty much everything that's been published in English for free. T.S. Eliot said that any poet who wants to continue being a poet after his 25th year must develop in himself what Eliot calls the historical sense. And he says this is a sense not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. A sense of the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer to the present, and within it, the whole of the literature of one's own country creates a simultaneous presence within the self of the reader. I'm using Eliot's words. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but I'm trying to quote Eliot's words here. It's a little mystical. And he says, a poet who has that historical sense, who feels like there's a simultaneous order and presence of the whole tradition within them, that may be someone who knows how to navigate writing in the present. Now, a lot of people have called Eliot snooty for this, and I've even quoted this before as a controversial statement in previous videos. But I think it's worth quoting again here. If we're to apprentice ourselves to the tradition of poetry, that is a great and long and complex and difficult act to put that within ourselves and to know, as Eliot says, not what is dead, but what is already living. I think that we live in an age where it's easier than ever to apprentice yourself to the great poets of the past without having to go get an MFA or a BFA. But goodness, it helps to be around people who are aware of it and familiar with it.